Let us say a very good morning, first of all, to Pauline Latham, Conservative MP for Mid-Derbyshire. Pauline, thanks for joining us.
Thank you.
Now, I've got to ask you, first of all, and I know you'll probably think it's a slightly tongue-in-cheek question, but what about it? How about we don't bother reopening the universities and we don't have to worry about all of this claptrap that gets taught to our young people at a very high price, and they end up sort of coming out and doing jobs which are no longer of any use to man or beast?
Well, I'm not quite sure that's absolutely correct, but I do agree this wokery has to stop. We've got to stop all of that, and we've got to get people learning properly and learning skills that are useful to the people out in the world who are going to employ them. Because
well, exactly right.
We need the education. I disagree with you about not opening them up, because I think you learn as much by talking to your peers, which you can't do on Zoom. You don't have
I get that,
Zoom.
But only, Pauline, if your peers allow you to have free and open discussion. Because if you're told by your peers that you can't have certain views, which is what the wokerati preach, then you're not actually learning anything. You're just sitting around talking in a bubble.
Yes, but I don't think that's the case in all universities and all groups. So you will learn and find the peer group that suit you, that you can get on with, that there are always, in all walks of life, there are groups of people you don't want to talk to, and there are groups of people you do want to talk to, and you'll go and find the ones you do.
I presume that goes for the Tory party as well in Westminster, because you're all singing from different hymn books at the moment. But I'll tell you what, there's some very interesting and what I would call encouraging noises coming out of Downing Street, and coming out indeed of some of the backbench Tory MPs about this lockdown. And it seems to me that there is now an acceptance that it has to come to an end. There's no more of this kind of talk of keeping things going for as long as we can. I think there's a recognition now that we need to get the economy back.
We do. We've got to get people out working normally, not just on Zoom. I mean, I'm doing this on Zoom. I would normally have come into a studio.
Yes.
And it works relatively well for this sort of thing, but it doesn't work for everything. And I've been working from home for almost a year, but except for a few weeks. And I want to get back to Westminster. I want to get back, because rather like universities, you learn so much by talking to your colleagues in the tea room, in the dining room, right, as well as being in the chamber and doing all your normal things. But it is a case of actually learning from what's going on around you. And I think that's really important for us all to try and get back to normal as soon as possible. Once we've got down all the four tiers, the groups that are vulnerable. I mean, I had mine the day before yesterday, which was brilliant and very exciting.
And how did you feel? Because I'm hearing from some people that they feel a bit sort of fluey for a couple of days, but that's about it.
No, I had the Pfizer jab, and apart from a slightly bruised top of my arm and slightly swollen, I would say I've had no side effects whatsoever. So my view is everybody has a duty to go and have it, because it protects all of us. I'm not just protecting myself, I'm protecting other people around me, and I think that's absolutely crucial.
And has that made the difference, do you think, to the government's kind of pivoting around now and actually looking at reopening schools? I mean, there are some people who say in the scientific community there's no reason why we need to even wait until March the 8th for that.
Well, I think we could start opening schools up, particularly primary schools could be opened up properly after half term, and then we open up secondary schools, because those children are missing so much educational time in front of a teacher, because at the end of the day, most parents are not teachers. Most parents are parents and have their own jobs. So they need to be able to get back to their work, and I think teachers will be really pleased to get their pupils back in front of them.
Well, that's right, because, I mean, we spoke to a school head the other day who said it's now clear that people learning on Zoom take in something like 20% of what they would otherwise be taking in a classroom. And you're quite right to talk about the human aspect of mingling with one another, albeit if you have to do it under certain precautionary measures. Yeah. But there's no question, in our business, particularly in the media, you get more ideas talking to one another. As things come up and you're sitting in the same office space, that's when ideas flourish, and that's when, you take one person's suggestion and you mold it into something else. You don't get any of that if you're waiting for somebody to call you on the phone or call you on Zoom, because you're not having that ongoing conversation.
Exactly. And I think we are human beings and we need to socialise, albeit in a relaxed way, in the pub or going out for dinner, or at work. And we do need that, and children need it in schools. They really do, and they need to be able to go out and play with their friends in the playground. That's a really important part of their life, and I think we've got to start freeing it up. So I would say primary schools could go back straight after half term as we're past the peak, and then secondary schools could go back on the 8th of March, which is when all people who've had their first vaccine, and that's over 70s, by the 15th of March, all of those will be 3 weeks into and have got the more immunity. And I think that's why it's such an important date.
And we're also seeing a lot of encouraging statistics now as well. Everything seems to be on a downward move on the graph. You know, infection rates are down. I mean, deaths are still relatively high, but they're coming down. And admissions to hospital also coming down as well.
I think that's a really important point. The deaths, it will take a while for those to come down, but the most important thing is people are not going into hospital in the same numbers that they were.
Right.
They're not being as ill in the community as they were, because the top people of the top age groups and the very vulnerable are being vaccinated, and they're being taken out of the system for catching coronavirus. Not only that, there's an awful lot of people in the country now have some immunity because they've had it. So there's some immunity from the general public who haven't been vaccinated yet. So by the time we've got to the 22nd of February and then the 8th of March, we should be able to make decisions by the 22nd of February, I would have thought, because that's another 3 weeks nearly. And I think that we've got to really set out a roadmap as to how we're going to do it. People will still have to be careful, and it will be irritating to still wear masks and socially distance for a time, but we do have to do that. And if that's the price of getting out and about and doing what I want to do instead of what I'm allowed to do, I will abide by that. That's not a problem.
And I think most people will do the same. And I mean, as far as the sort of the reopening of things is concerned, the weather's getting better as well. I mean, I know we're expecting a lot of snow over the next few days, but you know, that will be different in different parts of the country. You know, but as we get through February and we get into March, you know, you're going to have an awful lot of people who have either had the vaccine and or have had the disease.
And that's going to be quite a large number. I mean, we're getting through the vaccination so fast. It's fantastic. The only limiting factor is the vaccines coming through, the supply. Once that ramps up, we'll be able to do even more quickly, because there are people out there prepared to come and volunteer and help. And when I went 2 days ago, the volunteers were fantastic. They marshaled you through the system, they talked to you. So if anybody was nervous, they didn't have to be, because they got somebody to talk to reassure them. And you've got the doctors and nurses doing the jabs, and it's amazing.
And you've previously, Pauline, been quite an advocate for the pubs reopening as well. You know, the hospitality business particularly suffered over the course of the last year. And I mean, I think now we can look properly at some of the measures that a lot of the pubs put in and say, well, under the circumstances of the vaccinations and the infection rates and all of that, and the numbers of people who have had it and who might now be immune, I mean, surely you could institute an opening of pubs, you know, all the way from way down in Exeter in the West Country all the way up to Skipton in North Yorkshire. Just open them all and make sure that when they do open, they're ready to keep those measures in place. And I don't see why that couldn't be done in March as well.
Well, I agree. They've spent, some of them, tens of thousands of pounds making themselves COVID secure, and they've not been allowed to open.
Right.
So they've got the measures in place, and so long as they've got those measures in place, and so long as people abide by it, I think it's really important that they do, then they should be allowed to open, because we can't have all these businesses going down the pan.
No, exactly.
We've got to have them. We've got to have them working properly.
And as I've often said, to the point of repetition, this is not just about those of us who like going out and socialising and having a drink. It's about a business which creates billions of pounds. I mean, we've had the Bank of England talking about an economic bounce back. Well, in order for that to happen, people need to be able to spend their money somewhere, and taxes can be collected from that process, right?
Yes, absolutely. I mean, I'm not a great pub drinker. I don't go out to pubs very often, but I will do to get the businesses going. And that's what I did when we were allowed to in the summer. we went out more than we would normally do, because I'm quite happy to sit at home a lot of the time because I'm in London and having to eat out all the time. So, but I do want to support local businesses, and I think we all, if we've got the funds, and some of us have saved money whilst we've been working from home, others obviously haven't, and they're in a much more difficult situation. But those of us that can should be supporting our local businesses once we can.
Yes, I think that's absolutely right. And I'm hearing, I don't know whether you know anything about this, that Boris Johnson is about to say that when the pubs do reopen, they will take off some of those rather ridiculously confusing restrictions about having a Scotch egg and whether or not having a Scotch egg is a substantial meal.
Yeah, I think that, I mean, I understand why they did it, but it was a bit ridiculous. So, yes, I'd like to see normality returning.
Yes. I mean, the other thing that a lot of people are now talking about, including those in government, is making sure that when the lockdown is lifted, we don't ever have to go back into it. Now, having said that, obviously it's difficult to predict because we don't know what the next winter will bring. But if that is the case, would that mean then that some of the measures were wrongly sort of put upon us, as it were?
I don't know. I mean, it's very difficult to tell, and I'm not privy to the scientists and the scientific advice and knowledge that they have. I think we've had to do some of the measures we're doing. I don't like it any more than anybody else does, but we've had to do it. And I think most people have acted responsibly. There have been the few that haven't, and actually they should hang their heads in shame because they're the people that have spread it more than it needed to be spread. But I think as we're going down now in infections and hospitalisation and deaths, let's open up responsibly, let's act responsibly, and let's all work together to make sure that this doesn't come back in the terms. I know the scientists think it will in the autumn, but maybe we just, like we have a flu jab, I have a flu jab every year, maybe we have a coronavirus jab every year at the same time.
Yeah.
We can go in, have 2 jabs. I'm quite happy with that. And it will then take into account the different variances that are happening and the mutations. So if they can do that, like flu, because that mutates every year, they should be able to do it for this virus. And then hopefully the most vulnerable, like with flu, will not get it. And those that do get it, who are younger, bounce back much more quickly, just as they would with flu.
Yeah, but I think it's also important for government and ministers and local authorities and first ministers and you know, people in the Welsh Assembly and the Scottish Parliament to understand that the balance needs to be better if it ever does happen again. For example, I've got a tweet here from a listener, Jess, who says, my neighbour has a funeral tomorrow. She went to Tesco's because she desperately needed black tights and she was refused as it was deemed a non-essential item. And I mean, that's the kind of thing that drives people absolutely crazy. And there's no need for that, is there?
No. I mean, it's the same with birthday cards. Maybe they're not an essential item, but I mean, it was my birthday yesterday and I have some
Many
friends
happy returns.
Thank you. Many of my friends actually do have birthdays on the same day or roundabout now. I've run out of cards. So we've got a garden centre down the road, which actually I'm very critical that it's open, even because none of us are planting very much at the moment. But that's the only place I can get a reasonable card, and they're not that good. But supermarkets are
Maybe you
terrible.
should start making your own. I mean, far be it for me to advise you. But, you know.
Maybe I should, but actually what I'd like to do is have the time to do it.
Well, true. I mean, the thing about garden centres is they sell everything now. I mean, the garden centre that's local to me, it sells, you know, clothing, sells pottery, it sells food, it sells, you know, all manner of things that you wouldn't...
Soaps, perfumes.
Exactly. All manner of stuff. But they didn't...
It's a department store now.
Yeah, I know. Funnily enough, I went there one time, I think it was trying to get something for Halloween, and they had a whole Christmas grotto ready, right? This was in October. And I said, have you got any Halloween stuff? No, we don't do Halloween. I said, well, you do Christmas. I mean, I'm going, what's going on? But let's
it's crazy.
Let's talk about what we can do to pressurize the government, because obviously they will still be cautious, and that's what you would expect. But, you know, this quarantine idea, the hotels are going to be picking up 28,000 hotel rooms. Quite a lot of people thinking that's a bit too little too late and a bit difficult to organise. And also, we don't think you can make the individual passengers pay the actual hotel bill. So it'll have to be picked up by the government. Well,
they do in other countries. If you go to other countries, you pick up the bill. So people have to think very hard if they want to travel or not at the moment. So I think quarantining is a good idea, but I'm not sure whether the money wouldn't be better spent asking them to get a taxi from the airport to their home, wherever, would be cheaper for them.
Yeah.
But because the numbers of passengers, once they start going up, we cannot afford to quarantine that number. They're going to have to go home. And I think maybe it would be better value for money to send people home in a taxi,
Right.
And ask them to quarantine and check up on them. And I know the system is pretty good now on checking up on people. And if they're not in the home, then, they should be. And for me, that is an important thing.
But
that
what would you do about
what
that?
You need
though?
to do.
Would you fine people if they went out?
Yes,
or something?
I think you have to fine people. I think you have to just check up on them even more draconianly. I don't like the thought of that, but I think if we're going to keep this virus down and stop the mutations coming in, we've got to do that. But of course, some of the people coming in will be business visitors, and it's going to put them off going into a hotel for 10 days. Maybe business visitors at the moment don't need to travel and need to do things like this on Zoom,
yes,
rather than traveling. But the other problem is, of course, the industry, the airline industry, is crippled at the moment, and that's an industry we do need to get back to normal. And I am really pleased that the government has started talking about vaccine passports. I mean, if I go to Africa, which I do with being on the select committee to do with international development, I go regularly, not that I have for a year, I have to have a yellow fever certificate.
Right.
I don't mind that.
Right.
It's not an infringement on my liberty by having a certificate to prove that I've had yellow fever. Why would it be an infringement on your liberty to have a COVID vaccine certificate? And I think we're going to have to do it to be able to travel. That's fine. So that will open up the airline industry.
I suppose it's a question of whether that is something that people will buy into. For example, if you want to visit Greece is saying if you've got a COVID vaccination certificate, you can come to Greece and you won't have to quarantine. Yeah. I think that's fair enough as well. But if it sort of starts to become something that happens in, I don't know, the London Transport Network, that you can't get on a tube unless you can show a certificate. One, I think that's unworkable. Two, I don't think we could be going to that kind of extent.
No, we can't. So I don't agree with that, because we've got to allow free movement. And because we're going to know that the vast majority of people, adults, will have been vaccinated, and we'll know the numbers. And as I said before, I do think it's a responsibility on everybody who can have the vaccine to have it, not to protect themselves, but to protect the public, to protect everybody. My vaccine, yes, will help me, but it will also help everybody else I come into contact with. So that's a really important thing to do, to take your responsibility seriously to get rid of this virus. And the only way we'll do it is by mass vaccination.
Pauline, thank you very much indeed. Pauline Latham, Conservative MP for Mid-Derbyshire, whose birthday was yesterday, who's saying a lot of very sensible things this morning. You might not agree with everything she says, but Pauline has always been one of those sensible Tory MPs who understands what it's like to run a business, who understands why hospitality needs to be opened up again, who knows why children should go back to school even earlier than March the 8th, and I agree with her. I think there's no doubt that we're on the right track now. I think there's no doubt there will still be people who have problems and difficulties and complaints about the way the government's doing it. But let's face it, they've started to listen to what we've been saying, and that can only be a good thing. This is Talk Radio.
Online, on DAB+, and on the Talk Radio app.
So we still are in a position with very high numbers.
Talk Radio.